Hey, it's great to have all of you here, and thank you all for joining us. I'm going to give it another 30 seconds or so, but I am Amy Hanauer, the Executive Director of the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, and just so happy that we are making time for this great conversation today. All right, so I think we have a good grouping here. So I'm Amy Hanauer. I'm Executive Director of the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy. It's so nice to see so many great partners and friends joining us to talk about these very important issues. So in 2017, we passed, the United States Congress and President Trump passed a very big tax bill. And as our organization, partnering with Jeremie at that time, found it did very little for working class people of any race, and it did very little for Black and Brown communities. Yet it was an extremely costly piece of legislation, but it directed most of its benefits to the wealthiest Americans, to owners of corporate stock, and to the wealthiest communities. And so that has been the backdrop that we're all working against. And now we are back in a situation with President Trump in control, with two houses of Congress held by Republicans and another tax bill on the table. And I think our fear is that we will again end up with something that doesn't do very much for working class people of any race, that doesn't do much for working families, and that doesn't do much for communities of color. So we've gathered together some of the best minds in America to help us think and talk about these issues. And I'm really glad to have you all here. We will have some time for questions and answers at the end here. And you can drop your questions in the Q&A box here, and I'll be able to field those. But I want to turn it over to my good friend and a real force for these issues, Shana Bartley from the Kellogg Foundation. Shana, you can take it away.
Thank you, Amy, and thanks to all of you for joining today's session. I'm Shana Bartley, a policy officer on the policy advocacy team at the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, and I'm really grateful to welcome everyone to today's conversation. Speaking for myself as a child of immigrants, I want to acknowledge that we are existing through a consequential time in U.S. history where direct attacks on immigrant communities through family separations, deportations, and travel bans coincide with one of the most consequential tax debates ever. In times like this, it's important and urgent to turn to the helpers and builders for guidance, and I am grateful that we can gather to learn and think together about what we know and what we can do. The impact of the proposed tax plan will not be uniform across communities, replicating and deepening the effects of the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. For too long, tax policy was incorrectly positioned as colorblind. However, research from brilliant organizations like ITEP and scholars like Dorothy Brown have demonstrated time and again that tax policy increases racial wealth gaps rather than closes them. While some would like to obscure the impacts of the proposed tax provisions in the reconciliation bill, nonpartisan analysis from the Congressional Budget Office shows that if the proposed legislation was enacted, resources would decrease for households in the lowest 10% of the income distribution, whereas resources would increase for households in the highest 10%. Regressive tax policies like this hurt everyone, but overwhelmingly impact people of color by taking money out of the pockets of the lowest paid to give tax breaks to the wealthy. Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color are more likely to be in low-paid and unstable jobs and forced to the lower end of the income distribution in the United States. This is the result of ongoing policy choices that cement racial inequities, making it harder for communities of color to access the wealth and resources they create. To help us all understand what is at stake and what we can do differently to ensure the tax code is a tool for advancing racial justice rather than cementing inequity, we will learn from a stellar panel of researchers and advocates. In terms of the flow for today, as Amy mentioned, I'm going to ask the panelists a few questions and then turn back to her, who will facilitate an audience Q&A. Now, let's get into it with our panel, and I'm really grateful to be in conversation with Brakeyshia Samms, Senior Analyst at ITEP, Portia Allen-Kyle, Interim Executive Director at Color of Change, and Jeremie Greer, Co-Executive Director at Liberation in a Generation. So this first question is for all of you. If you could introduce yourself and share a little bit about your work before answering, that would help folks get a flavor of your expertise. From your perspective, what's the most important takeaway that people should know about the impact of the 2017 tax law and racial justice? Maybe I'll ask Brakeyshia to kick us off.
Sure. Thank you, Shauna. That's an excellent question. Again, my name is Brakeyshia Samms. I'm a senior analyst at the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy. We're something like a small but mighty shop that works on tax policy. We use data-driven analysis to make recommendations to lawmakers, the public, the media. We have teams that work on federal, state, and local policy, and we fight for fair tax policies that improve the equity in the tax code. And so I think what's important is that the 2017 Trump tax law was trumpeted as a major boost to the pocketbooks of all households. But in actuality, it was just a major giveaway to the wealthy. And so Trump and Congress chose to grow the economic gap between the rich and everyone else. But as we talk about today, they also chose to grow the gap between white households and households of color because white wealthy households are disproportionately white. And so when we did some research, we found that of the $275 billion in tax cuts from the first year of TCJA, 80% of those benefits went to white households. But keep in mind, those white households were also very wealthy. They were in the top 1%. So we have to keep thinking about how racial equity really makes a difference in how the tax code functions when we think about the 2017 Trump tax laws.
Thanks, Brakeyshia. Really appreciate that level setting. Portia, can I turn to you?
Yes, absolutely. And, again, thank you for being here. My name is Portia Allen-Kyle. I'm the Interim Executive Director at Color of Change. We are a racial justice organization powered by members across the country that hold government and corporate actors to account on real solutions for Black people and Black communities. And so, for us, and part of why this work is so important is because, we are greatly focused on systemic inequities, right? And when we're thinking about the tax code, it's not that the tax code necessarily has created a lot of the economic inequities that we experience and that like people feel on a daily, regular basis, but it is a way of maintenance, and it is often a quiet background way of maintenance that that people assume is just given and static, as opposed to a consistent choice by policymakers, by government, by power brokers, including corporations that that underwrite and support a lot of those in power who are making these decisions that consistently favor the wealthy, that consistently favor white households, often at the expense of everybody else. And so, to Brakeysia's point, and to some of the overall framing of today, it is not just about the individual level benefits for us, of Black families, but really thinking systematically and collectively. And so, the one thing. And Shana, really appreciated, in your opening remarks, just connecting to this moment that we are kind of living in. Just today, Josh Hawley sent a letter to 200 nonprofit organizations as a part of a congressional inquiry. And, something that is often not talked about from that 2017 law and the impact to today is the way in which increases to the standard deduction that are sometimes framed as benefiting everybody have actually functioned to wipe out a lot of charitable giving. And so that means, since 2017, it's your local churches, your food banks, your advocacy organizations, your favorite nonprofits that on the whole are receiving a lot less charitable giving from individuals than they were previously. And that directly also impacts the ability to serve communities. And so it isn't just that the system itself is, to the disadvantage of Black households and individual wealth, but also collectively for the resources and things that people have come to rely on, especially given this pullback of federal support, funding, et cetera, really has implications on Black families and communities on a day-to-day from a number of different angles, some of which are more silent or in the background or less known than others.
Thanks, Portia, and thanks for reminding us that as we speak, things are happening and these forces are kind of increasing their impacts just in this conversation. Jeremie, over to you.
All right, thanks, Shana. Jeremie Greer, I'm Liberation Generation. We're a movement support organization that works with grassroots leaders to dismantle what we call the oppression economy, which is the economy we live in, and look to envision and build towards what we call a liberation economy, one that really cares for all people of color. A couple lessons I learned from the last time around was one, the first lesson I think I learned was, well, one, not lesson, it was more monument of a moment, which was for the first time, I felt like we could say the thing out loud, which was tax policy is contributing to white supremacy and systemic racism. And we could do that because of the scholarship that has already been acknowledged in this. Dorothy Brown, the work that I was fortunate enough to be involved with my colleague Emmanuel Nieves with ITEP, and we were able to put numbers to what we kind of knew, which was that the tax system was contributing or embedded in our kind of systemic racism and white supremacy that's built into our public policy. The other thing the lesson though that I really came away with was an inside game in and of itself will not win the day. We did the inside thing in 2017. We did not take this to the street, and we got steamrolled. And the numbers are all there, almost $2 trillion in tax breaks when 80% going to the very wealthy, 80% going to white families. And the lesson I learned is that we have to take this to the streets. This impacts people's wallets. This impacts people's daily lives. And because of that, we have to take this to the streets and take this to the folks in the grassroots. And in an inside game, we will get steamrolled because the amount of money you need to have to win that game, we just do not have. That money talks inside. Voices don't, and we need voices. We need them to battle us on our playing field. So that's the lesson that I took.
Oh, yeah, you can see why I was excited for today, just getting started. Brakeyshia, could you tell us a little bit about where the federal tax debate currently stands? What has already happened? We talked a little bit about it in the opening, but like what is likely to happen next and how you all are responding?
Sure. The House of Representatives passed the One Big Beautiful Bill Act on May 22nd, which was a major tax and spending legislative bill. And so now it's in the Senate, and they're probably going to make a number of changes, and they may vote on that bill as early as next week. But I think it's important to keep in mind that we have to continue to uplift these racial equity implications and keep the conversation going during this debate so that they understand what this means for Black and brown communities in the long run. And so it's important to keep that in mind when we think about the next steps in this congressional debate. And so ITEP, we did an analysis of the House tax plan and also Congress's Joint Committee on Taxation analysis of the tax plan synced up with ours, showing that it's clear the House tax plan would be regressive. And what I mean by that, it's showing that how the larger tax cuts as a share of income would go to higher income taxpayers compared to either middle class or working class families. And so to take a step back and talk about the actual provisions in the bill, the first kind of chunk of the bill would extend the TCJA provisions. So it would increase the standard deduction, kind of what Portia was talking about a little bit earlier. There's still no personal exemption. That did not come back. It increases the child tax credit by $500. So it increases to $2,500, but it keeps the same rules. And so that means very low income families do not get the child tax credit. And this disproportionately hurts families of color, but this also disproportionately hurts very low income families. And so when you're thinking about putting racial justice in the tax code, you have to think about expanding the CTC to make it fully eligible for everyone, like it was done in 2021 with the American Rescue Plan. And so also they increased the pass-through deduction, which so when you are a taxpayer, there are people who have businesses and they don't pay a corporate income tax. Instead, their profits are passed through to the individual owners and they're taxed on their personal income taxes. And so for the original pass-through deduction, which was 20%, and they want to increase it to 23%, for the original pass-through deduction of 20%, the benefits of that deduction from a Treasury Department report, 90% of those benefits went to white households. So it's showing kind of a lopsided beneficial system of not helping people of color with the business, which makes sense. The business system is racially skewed. And so other provisions include extending and expanding the estate tax exemption, and also extending a change in the rates and brackets that were put into the 2017 tax law. There's an increase for the state and local tax deduction from $10,000 to $40,000. This means that wealthier taxpayers can deduct more money they pay in state and local taxes from their federal taxes. And then there's newer provisions in this law that were some of which were on the campaign trail, like the deduction for tips and overtime pay, the exclusion of what you pay in car loan interest. But an interesting one was an unprecedented dollar for dollar tax credit for donations to groups that fund private K through 12 school vouchers. So we're having conversations about vouchers on the state and local level, but now it's in the federal level in the House tax bill. And then there's an increased deduction for seniors. And so while you think about these core platform proposals, they're actually a small slice of the pie in the tax cut. It's only about 4% of the tax cut. The business tax cuts these tax cuts that he talked about, helping the middle class and working families, the businesses actually got 4 times as much of a larger tax cut than the campaign proposals that were supposed to help families. So who does he really prioritize? And when you think about racial equity, we need to really have leaders and policymakers thinking about how to reprioritize middle and low income families that really make a difference, and have a bottom up approach instead of trickle down to really build our economy back up so families are financially secure, healthy, nourished, and really succeeding, and that we have a really good, strong, robust budget. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Brakeyshia, because I think especially for organizations like mine who really are focused on kids and families, I think having access to this information to really understand, this bill is intentionally big, and there's a lot in there, and just grateful to you all for digging in and helping us understand it and make meaning and really be clear about what is in it for kids and families, and it really isn't much. And so just thank you for walking us through that. I'm going to turn to Portia and Jeremie, because I'd love to hear how you all with your networks, with your connections, and through your work and scholarship, how you all are making meaning of this proposal, and what your organizations are doing to educate people so they can push back on these really extractive and damaging policy ideas. Jeremie, do you want to kick us off?
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, so one, we're doing a lot of work to think about what is the correct analysis that we have to have around the role that the tax policy plays in our lives. And it's not just federal tax policy, but also state tax policy. So at the same time this is happening, states across the country are looking at slashing taxes as well. This whole conservative kind of MAGA way of thinking about tax policy is everywhere. So for example, in Texas, they're looking at cutting, almost over $50 billion in property taxes in the state of Texas. So this is an analysis that is pervasive. And the thing that we think is important is to, one, inform people that the tax system plays a couple roles. One, it is a system that is used to, the way it sits now, as a system that allows corporate dominance over our lives, right? The corporations are basically incentivized through the tax system to keep their wages low, to cut corners on safety, to lay off workers, because their share prices are the way in which they reward their shareholders directly through profits, but also the tax benefits that they get when they file their taxes at the end of the year. All of these things are linked. The other thing that we think is important is that the tax system in and of itself, because it's a part of the government, because it's a part of our democracy, is a mechanism for self-governance. It is the mechanism in which we bring in the revenue that is utilized throughout our economy to advance the needs of people, particularly and the focus that we have is around Black and brown people. That's one role it plays. The other role it plays is it's a way that we can disincentivize certain behaviors or punish certain behaviors through the tax code. So instead of rewarding corporations for low wages, laying off workers, so on and so forth, we could use the tax code to punish or to disincentivize that type of behavior. So the tax code plays this role of self-governance that we can be a part of because we are a part of because the democracy in and of itself answers to us. So, but the question is like, and I mentioned that we need to bring this fight to the streets. So I know one of the questions people have, well, how do we do that? Well, we've lost a lot of ground because we've allowed this conversation to stay in, and these are all people that I know and are friendly and great. We've allowed it to sit in academia. We've allowed it to stay inside the Beltway. We've allowed it to stay within, kind of the elite conversations. And because of that, people don't know a lot about taxes. They know what what the people at H&R Block or Intuit or the guy down the street that does their taxes for them. They know what they tell them about their taxes, but they don't know a lot about the way the system works and the way that people understand labor systems, housing systems, education systems, childcare systems. These are all systems that people have in the grassroots and in the advocacy world have a lot of knowledge about, but they don't have a lot of knowledge in tax. And what we're doing is really saying, okay, we cannot let that be anymore. So we have to take that education out into communities, out to the grassroots, and not just, and my belief is people used to always say, well, people aren't going to care. People care about the things they care about, and taxes is connected to it. And it's our job to help educate them around that so that they can become better advocates around the things that they care about, whether it's housing, whether it's childcare, or whatever that may be. So that's a lot of what we're doing. And again, I could get into more detail through the Q&A or another question. Yeah.
Thanks, Jeremie. And I really just appreciate that point around like people know what they know and what you are able to communicate to them. And like people are often being forced to make choices around, do we want more funding for our schools or do we want, better roads? And those are false choices that are created when we obscure what tax policy does and people's ability to influence and impact how electeds make decisions around our money. And Portia, I know Color of Change does a lot of great work educating folks about this through their membership. Would love to hear what you all are working on right now.
Absolutely. I mean, there's so much in this moment that has really created so much opportunity to engage our members around a number of different issues. And, because as Jeremie mentioned, like if you ask somebody, what's your, thought of taxes and housing, they're like, well, I don't really have a story of taxes and housing. I don't really think about it that way. But people do have a story of how much rent costs at the end of the month. People have a story about, what or have a plan often for what they're going to do should they receive a refund. They have a plan, and can tell you about the ability to make ends meet and pay the bills every single month and like where exactly things fall short. And all of those things have connections to the tax code, both at an individual level and collectively at a community level. And so we've been doing a lot of education around, and particularly for this bill, some of the implications of the provisions that, stand in the way of us collectively having nice things and needing to make sure that us having nice, like my having something nice is not dependent on your thing being raggedy, right? And we can all collect by making different choices and different policy choices, we can collectively have nicer things, live to higher standards. We can incentivize better corporate behavior that also, has ties to cost of living. Right now, corporations, for example, are incentivized to pay less, maximize share, profits, et cetera. We could think about corporate incentives that perhaps, shame some companies or reward others that have workers on the payroll that also qualify for public benefits because wages are so low. We can, use the tax code to think about different behaviors. And so for us, when we're talking to our members, we're not only just informing folks what is happening in this debate and conversation, both now about this reconciliation bill and beyond, because it will continue to be a conversation, and we need a long-term organizing strategy to bring people in, to the conversation. And I think it'll be important to link what's happening at the federal level to the state level. And we are then translating the stories that people have and the experiences, that folks are living to into what are the implications of that in the tax code. And that, runs the gamut. There's been so much conversation, for example, about student loan debt and the problems of, the affordability of student loans and payments. And this administration is currently trying to, eliminate and make cuts in this proposal to student financial aid, changing payment plans, and all types of things that are really going to disproportionately harm Black households, but especially Black women who tend to pursue higher education at higher rates than others, and also tend to hold more student loan debt in proportion to others. But there are provisions in the code that we can do differently and expand that might make the burden of student loans easier, right? Like we don't have to limit your educational opportunity credit to 4 years of eligibility. You don't have to, think of the student loan deduction as it exists, limit it to income so that it tapers off and people can't take advantage of it by the time they're actually able to afford their monthly payments, because they've made it, into that part of their career. And so talking to our folks and hearing what folks are going to, and then thinking and imagining what a different system can look like is just as important as educating, folks on what the issue is now, so that we're not just standing against and denouncing what's happening in the moment, but we're also working towards a collective vision of what's possible under a different system and down the line in the future. The kind of last thing I'll say on that, and really about the connecting the federal level fight to the state level fight, what's happening with a lot of these cuts across the country and at the federal level, and particularly just one example, funding that came from President Biden's, bipartisan infrastructure law. As they are withholding funds and cutting back on projects across the country, what we saw recently is like 50 or so local initiatives that are about increasing sales taxes to pay for infrastructure. Sales tax are a regressive tax that sounds fair, except it hits lower income folks disproportionately hard. But there was a federal solution and funding for that. And now we're telling communities that in order for you to have roads that work and transportation that can get you from point A to point B, whether that is from home to school, home to work, or otherwise, we have to increase your sales tax and what you pay on, regular goods, in some places, what you pay on groceries, in order to, go down a road that is safe and can get you from point A to point B. And collectively, we need to make the connections and decide and stand up, and to Jeremie's point, take it to the streets to say some of these is just unacceptable as solutions.
Just one point on that, it's so important what Portia just said, because the scarcity is the point. That is why they're doing it. It's not just, it's one, they want to raid the coffers for their own wealth, but also the scarcity creates a system in which people are so desperate that they have to look to the private sector and to corporations for their own livelihood, which means they have more power and control over us. So so that point that Portia made is just so important.
I wish we could keep talking all afternoon because there's so much to unpack in the last set of comments. Really going to be thinking about, like, we can all have nicer things, that once people know more and are empowered with information, they can make different choices, and demand different things. And so just really appreciate, all of the comments. This next question, and this was the last of kind of the set questions, and we'll be turning to the audience soon. So audience, please start dropping in your questions to the chat for Amy. But this question is for all three of you. Obviously, we're living in a moment where the political context at the federal level in particular, but I think as you all rightly named, we're also seeing some of this play out in states. It's a challenging political context. But all three of you, I know, in following your work, think a lot about what are some alternatives that get us to a better place. And I'm really curious if you could share with the audience, like, what would you point to as alternatives to what's currently on the table? And what are some of the ones that you think would do a much better job to advance racial equity through the tax code instead of what's currently being offered? And happy to talk state, federal, wherever you all are really paying attention and seeing good things, or thinking of, or seeing hopeful things. Maybe Brakeyshia, we haven't talked to you in a little bit, so do you want to kick us off?
Sure. I think something that, as an analyst thinking through using the tax system as a tool for fighting justice, I have to remind myself sometimes that, yes, tax policy has been used to make a lot of bad decisions and a lot of ill-fated consequences that have hurt a lot of communities, but it also can be a tool for good. And so I think one of the tools that tax policy could be used for is attacking the inheritance problem. And so I think addressing that could be through restoring the estate tax exemption to its 2001 level. And I think that because people across the country are concerned about food assistance, healthcare, public services that are part of this house tax plan, but at the same time, people are worried about wealth inequality. And so reducing this exemption amount would raise billions of dollars that would both go towards investing in these public priorities, but it would also address the racial wealth gap. So you kind of get a 1-2 punch. And so I think, as it stands right now, less than 99% of Americans pay the estate tax. So, we would never pay the estate tax at all. And in 2001, the exemption was $675,000. And if adjusted for inflation today, we would pay 1.2 million. And so that still wouldn't touch us. Back in 2001, that was only 2% of estates that paid the estate tax. And so again, that's 98% of Americans that would never pay the estate tax. But in the house tax plan, they want to increase the estate tax. So where nearly, if you inherit an estate that's 29.99 million, you would not have to pay an estate tax. You would pay no tax on that estate you inherit. Do you know how much money and revenue we could capture from that estate, from those estates, and use that money to invest in Medicaid, to invest in food assistance, to invest in college financial aid, to invest in transportation grants to states and localities and things like that, and to invest in reducing the racial wealth gap that has been building up since the end of slavery. And so I think addressing that through restoring the estate tax exemption is a really strong candidate for a solution to making the tax code more stronger for racial equity. And another candidate I think is also taxing income from work. So think like, you go to your day-to-day job, and then when you get a W-2 at the end of the year, the same as income from wealth. And think of that as buying stocks and buying, when you get your dividends or whatever, and taxing that the same because you use that as income. And when you use your money from income, you may pay a certain tax rate, but then you get the money from stocks, you pay a lower tax rate. And so you may be in the same bracket as somebody, but because your portfolio has more wealth, you pay a lower tax rate. And that disproportionately helps white households because they tend to have more income from wealth. And so that goes to show you that it's not a fair tax code. And so income from work and income from wealth need to be taxed at the same because they're typically used for the same reason as income. So I think just using those two candidates as a way to incorporate racial equity into the tax code, to me, makes sense right off the bat. So I'll let my other colleagues talk about some as well.
Thank you so much. Let's keep hearing these good ideas. Portia, can we pass to you?
Yes, absolutely. And, plus one, completely agree. Taxing wealth like work is a step in the right direction. As a general posture, we also think that there are a number of ways and provisions, either through the current code or this current code doesn't have to be the one we live under forever, that there are a number of options to just do something differently, that not only change the trajectory of maintenance of the racial wealth gap, but can actually shift it in a different direction. But for the current moment, and to the question, I think the one thing I would hone in on are the student loan interest deduction provisions. And so especially with all of the litigation around the legality of some of the SAVE plans and the income dependent repaid plans, figuring out ways in the code to alleviate some of the burden of folks who are paying student loans. So for example, the $2,500 cap on the student loan interest deduction has been the same since 1997. But what's gone up since 1997? The cost of college, the cost of loans, the interest rates on the loans. There's a lot that has happened since 1997. And so, you can quadruple that to $10,000 and it would still somewhat be a drop in the bucket, especially for folks paying student loans on professional school. And we need dentists, doctors, lawyers, social workers, et cetera, just as much as we need college graduates at the undergraduate level, right? And so figuring out some alleviation there, and also increasing the income threshold so that for especially folks, those thresholds have also been the same since 2012. And so what has changed since 2012, right, is the size of student loan debt, is the average income. And so adjusting the threshold up both for single filers and for joint filers, you can lift it up to an adjusted gross income of at least 160 for single and 300 for joint, and still probably leave a number of folks out who could use the relief on student loan interest. And so just thinking about the ways, there are just a number of ways. We can also turn it into a refundable credit. That is always the best way if you really want to help people and give some people money. And so just thinking, especially in this graduation season, it'll be summertime and then it'll be back to school season. So front of mind, how to make sure that we are not blocking off opportunity for folks to access college as is proposed in this bill. And so fighting against some of those changes on the front end now, and also thinking about, long-term, what are some alternatives, whether it be in current proposals or down the line, to alleviate what we know is a problem.
Thanks, Portia. Jeremie, please round us out.
Yeah. Well, one, I just want to start with the current fight and just say there's nothing in this bill that is worth our support. So this bill has to go down. That's where we are. So there's no idea that I'm going to put forth that could redeem this bill. So this is all talk for another fight. as Portia talked about. I have two things that I think are great that I want to focus on. One is putting money in Black and brown people's pocket. Like that should be a goal of whatever tax reform we do. And that is done through refundable credits. Portia mentioned it. One thing that I've thought about, and there's a lot of proposals out there, we could actually take the earn out of the earned income tax credit and just make it an income tax credit. And we can make it a credit that is actually robust enough that it brings people up to a standard of living that is livable wherever they live in the United States. There's that earned income tax credit acts as a guaranteed income right now, but it is not big enough, and it is too damn complicated for it to have the kind of impact that it should have, even as impactful as it is. So I would say we have to create a real robust income credit to put in people's pockets. We could also do things like credits around rent. Instead of subsidizing mortgages, we could subsidize rent. There's a lot of things we could do to put more money in Black and brown folks' pockets. The other thing that I think that we can do and should focus on doing is, and I mentioned it up top, is really, I'll say punish, because I think these people are egregious and they deserve punishment. I am not a like redemption idea person when it comes to a lot of corporations. We should punish them for bad behavior. If you are not paying your workers a livable wage, you should be taxed for that. If you are harming your workers on the shop floor or violating workplace law, you should be taxed for that. Like there are ways in which the tax code could incentivize or again punish bad behavior that would have huge downstream impacts for people of color. So I would say that those are two areas that I would focus future reforms on. And again, the type of things that I think we could take to the streets and people will get, and they would want to get behind, and they would want to use their voice and their power to enforce.
Thank you all. I've been scribbling notes as I could keep up with you. This has been really powerful for me and instructive for me, and I hope our participants also feel the same way. And I know some have, because I see that there are some questions. So I will just say thank you to Brakeyshia, Portia, and Jeremie for allowing me to be in conversation with you. And I'm going to pass to Amy to guide us through the Q&A.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been a really provocative conversation. I will just answer this first question in the chat and because it's or in the Q&A. And then if any of you want to also jump in on that, that's great. And then I'll pose a second question in the Q&A that I'm pretty sure many of you will have some things to say. So one question we got was on the no tax on tips, will it lead to lower Social Security payments after retirement? The no tax on tips proposal doesn't affect the payroll tax, so it shouldn't affect people's Social Security post-retirement. So that is not something that we need to worry about that particular proposal. But I think Brakeyshia said something really good when she was talking that might have gotten a little buried in all the points that she was making, which is that there were all these very high profile things on the campaign trail: no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, no tax on Social Security, there were car loans. But when you put all of those provisions together, all of those ones that got so much attention on the campaign trail, they are not what is contributing to the cost of this bill. They make up less than 4% of the total cost of this bill when you add them all together. But they've gotten a disproportionate share of the interest and media discussion. And so I think this comes back to something that Jeremie was saying, which is that this is overall a big tax shift to the very wealthy in this tax bill. It is really not something that improves equity. And so there may be some little throwaway pieces that sound good. Actually, some of them are somewhat flawed, and people can go to epi.org if they want to read a little bit more about some of the challenges with the tip provision and the overtime provision and some real solutions that could help tip workers or workers who need overtime. But they don't redeem this bill, and they don't constitute the main part of this bill. I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in on the tip provision. Yeah, it looks like Jeremie.
I have a point on it, but it's not about the tax. The thing I worry about this is There are so many corporations already trying to get out of paying a livable wage through tips and through overtime that this becomes an excuse to incentivize bad behavior again. So again, I that's what I fear about those provisions that actually have little to do with the taxes themselves, but of the behavior of corporate America right now. So just want to say that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. If nobody else wants to jump in on that, I will just, oh, did you want to, Portia? No, okay. I will just say, there are states that are doing some really good things that I think the federal government could learn from. And Brakeyshia, I know you sometimes work on state issues too. I mean, there are things I could elevate, but there may be things that you want to elevate that you've seen in the states, and that's something that some folks in our audience are wondering about.
For question number 1 or number 2?
Oh, this is just another question that I got.
Oh, just another. Oh, just okay.
Just
Yeah, so
like-
there have been some really bright spots in Maryland lately. They had a $3.3 billion deficit, and legislators this year really showed up. They made much needed tax reforms, and they provided progressive revenue raisers that helped meet the state's needs while making the tax code less regressive. And what they did was they kind of did a split package. So they addressed the problems they had with their wealthiest taxpayers. And what they did there was they made new income brackets, a reduced itemized deduction, and a capital gain surcharge. And then they helped their middle class and low income taxpayers by benefiting from a higher standard deduction and a modestly enhanced child tax credit. And so the idea of them helping, like splitting the two groups, but then helping address the issues of their ongoing kind of budget crisis, really, and like helping to make sure that they can fund their budget and get everything squared away, but then also have a pretty structurally sound tax system, I think is a really kind of important story to take away this year from their from the state's side. But then also in the past few years, we've seen some pretty good positive strides in Massachusetts with their millionaires tax, Washington with their capital gains excise tax, New Jersey, Minnesota, which I think is something I can answer with another question. New Mexico, they did something with their capital gains tax. And then these states, they took steps to either raise their revenue, fund services, and even reduce poverty. And so I think they're improving the lives of Black and Brown communities, but people of all races. And I think that's important to think about. I know Portia highlighted that earlier about that Fed-state connection. And that's really important to think about, because I think sometimes when we're reading the news, we get caught up in the federal stuff, but we forget about the issues that are at our front door. And that's what makes a difference, because that whole tax bill that we see at the end of the year, that's what that really impacts our pocketbooks. And so what's going on the state and local level is really important for us to think about. And that has racial implications too. So that's a great question. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Brakeyshia. So there was another question in the Q&A section that was wondering, is there an argument to be made that taxing capital gains, should be done at a higher rate than earned wages, that would incentivize work and maybe flip some of the narratives out there? So I think Jeremie might have something to jump in on here, and I also have a little bit to say. It looks like maybe Brakeyshia has something to say too, but I'll start with Jeremie.
Yeah. I would wholeheartedly support the idea of a higher rate. We've been talking about equalizing the rate between wages and capital gains, but I would endorse a higher rate. But what I want to emphasize the capital gains is we recently did a report with ITEP on corporate taxes, which I hope gets dropped in the chat. If it's not on hand, I'll go find it and drop it. But it's what we found there is that with the corporate tax bill, the benefits of the corporate tax bill, only about 1% of those benefits went to Black families. And there's a reason for that. It is because Black families own less than 1% of the value in the entire stock market. So Black families have been systemically held out of, and it's similar case for Latino families, been held out of the stock market, so they aren't able to even take part in the idea of getting capital gains, to then even begin to get a tax break from it. And what we also found in that report was that 40% of the benefits of from corporate tax are given to go out the door to foreign investors. So I only emphasize that because yes, I would support this idea around capital gains and enhancing it, but I would also say that we have to work on the corporate side to offset the imbalance that is further perpetuated capital gains, because it is the shareholders of these companies that are benefiting. So they're benefiting on both sides, where Black and brown folks are not benefiting on either side of that scenario. So I just wanted to lay that, but yeah, I would support that.
So and that's great, Jeremie, and I would agree with you entirely. Like, we've been talking about a lot of the things that this tax bill would make worse, but there are good provisions in our tax code at the federal and state level. And one of those is that we do tax corporations, right? Like, so we could strengthen that instead of trying to weaken it, which is what a lot of what this bill would do. That we do have a progressive income tax at the federal level, and that is a very, very important part of our tax code. We could strengthen that. We could add a new bracket at the top. We could raise the top rate instead of trying to weaken it. And then when it comes to capital gains, I entirely agree that we should not be taxing capital gains at a lower rate than income from work. That doesn't make sense. And there are a couple of states that are kind of waking up to that. So in both Maryland and Minnesota, they have raised the capital gains tax rate above the earned income tax rate. And then Washington State, which is, we don't love to highlight because they don't have an income tax, which is problematic, but they have put through a capital gains tax in Washington State. So there too, it's higher. And those are really well targeted because they fall on the wealthiest people, the people who are earning most of their income from wealth, and they enable us to raise really important revenue that we can invest in all of our communities. So I don't know if others have anything to add to that capital gains answer. Otherwise, I have one more question that I can ask, and then I think we might be getting near the top of the hour. But anyone else want to jump in on capital gains? Okay, so then just the only other thing that I wanted to ask was a question that came in for Portia, which is just, you're a membership-based organization. So I believe that you do some like story gathering or really talking directly to people. What are some of the things that you've been hearing in some of those stories as you've gathered those this year related to taxes? I mean, you could probably give me a mouthful on other things too, but.
I mean, I think the theme of what we hear is how things don't work for folks. Like that is the overall link together of, you know, how folks are feeling and what folks are going through. And so we, for example, a few weeks ago, the team brought a number of our members and we hit the Hill. We hit over 100 congressional offices, you know, talking to folks about the harms of this current proposal and provision. And that's both because the harms of this provision, like we've been talking a lot about what's in it on the tax side. We haven't talked as much about how they're trying to pay for it, and how they're trying to pay for it is by taking food from kids, like taking healthcare from folks that need it. They're, you know, taking student loan assistance. They're, you know, a whole host of things. And those stories that people are telling are not just here's how the code isn't working, but also here's how my life will be tangibly worse should some of the things that are being used to pay for these cuts come through. And I just don't know that it is worth sacrificing someone's ability to have oxygen that they need on a daily basis in order to subsidize a yacht. Like, it's just a hard it's a hard thing to talk through. It seems like it should be pretty straightforward and easy to, you know, keep folks healthcare and otherwise. But the stories we're hearing run the gamut of, you know, how how folks are really have benefited from a number of the programs. You know, healthcare has allowed them to live like, or allowed them to take care of, you know, things that they would not have otherwise had access to, about how, you know, some of the food programs, you know, I myself had reduced lunch when I was going through school, right? Like, these are things that have allowed kids to move through and on to other opportunity because they're just simply not hungry. And so a lot of our members have those stories. They have the stories of, you know, what the child tax credit has done for them. They also have the stories of like, well, you know, here's what happened as I had a different income situation, you know, from year to year, and the tax consequences of that. I got a raise and it, you know, put me into another tax bracket. I, you know, worked some overtime and it, you know, put me here, and how collectively we just have a system that does not work for folks.
Great. So we are almost at time. I don't know if anybody else has like a closing sentence. I mean, I'll just say, if I had a thought I wanted to leave people with, it is just that we know some tools that really work in the tax code. Some of them are in parts of our tax code at the federal or state level. We can build on those, and this bill is not it. I think, as Portia really highlighted, I mean, this is cutting healthcare and food security for families so that we can give tax cuts that disproportionately go to the wealthiest Americans. So that's the thought I would want to leave people with. I don't know if any of you else want to jump in on a final closing thought, but this has been a great, great conversation. If not, I can give people their 2 minutes back, but thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you to this amazing panel for just some really profound thoughts. And I just hope that we're meeting again in a year or 2 years or 3 years or 4 years and talking about a really hopeful proposal that could move us forward instead of talking about something that's going to move us backward. Thank you so much for all of your time today.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.